This is James Patterson here. He's one of the owners and founders of AgroTech USA. James is probably one of the smartest people I've ever listened to.
Don't know about that.
When it comes to fertility and how different nutrients interact within the soil and how we can best utilize those nutrients doing some different things. So we asked him to come and speak here today just to talk a little bit about the fertilizer markets, what we're kind of seeing right now, what that looks like, again, kind of how nutrient availability and efficiency in our soils and how to best utilize those, and then just a little bit about potentials of what we could maybe do differently for 2026 to be a little bit more efficient. So going through this, so I'll hand it off to James.
Cool. Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for coming. James Patterson from AgroTech USA, obviously not from the States. Obviously, New Zealand is my home, so I've lived here for about 12 years and started AgroTech about 10 years ago with the primary goal of addressing phosphorus challenges in the soil in terms of fertilizer efficiency. So what we'll talk about a little bit today is the markets on P. We'll talk about how P reacts in the soil. From a fertility standpoint, we're going to talk about how plants access P and just broaden the concept around trying to make it more efficient, because in today's market, especially with the pricing now, we have to be more efficient when it comes to our fertility. So, the first thing we'll talk about is the fact that, right now, in terms of an index between the price of corn and the price of fertilizer, the gap is as big as it's ever been. So it takes more bushels of corn to pay for a ton of phosphorus than it has any time in history. So why is this happening? Obviously, I think if we look at the fertilizer market for phosphorus, we have a couple major suppliers in the United States. There's 3 mines. So we've got Mosaic, we've got Simplot, and there's another one that Nutrien owns on the East Coast. And then the rest of the fertilizer comes basically from an import perspective. If you look globally at where the main supplies are, we've got Morocco, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia. So obviously areas where politics come into play. We've seen the impact of the Ukraine war on phosphorus fertilizer prices when it first started. We've seen the impact of any tariff negotiations that the US has right now on just either both grain prices as well as fertility prices. So we've seen it increase in terms of what it will look like in the spring. Typically, fertilizer prices are higher in the spring than they are in the fall, but this could be one of those situations where maybe if there's more supply that comes in, prices could soften a little bit as we come into the spring. Irrespective, we're still paying a lot per ton of MAP. I think if we go back to this chart here and look at the pricing, the bushels of corn per ton, if we look at the pricing across here, obviously as commodity prices have dipped, that's come up, but we haven't seen a lot of swings where phosphorus fertilizers dropped. I mean, has anyone priced from a dry source around here? It's basically, what are your options for fertility on phosphorus? What are they pricing you guys now? Do you guys use dry fertilizer in the fall? Some dry fertilizer in the fall, so it's typically what in this area? Triple or something like maize on those standpoints. Yeah, so it's one of these things that with it, there's a lot of logistics involved with moving phosphorus fertilizer. We know America has a limited resource of phosphorus fertilizer that's economically extractable that we call right now. So anyone estimates 25 to 35 years of economically extractable phosphorus. So there's a lot of pressure on the supply chain and a lot of uncertainty around pricing. What we do know that is a certainty is if you look at, is everyone aware of how we make phosphorus fertilizer in the first place? So one of the interesting things is, when MAP was actually invented. So MAP, primarily historically, we used what was called rock phosphate. So rock phosphate was calcium phosphate. So we would go to deposits, whether it was like Soda Springs in Idaho or somewhere that had a high level of calcium phosphate in the soil. They would mine it, pelletize it, and we'd apply it to the fields. And we would get yield responses in low pH situations. In the 70s, it was TVA or Tennessee Valley started ammonia production, and what they ended up doing was figuring out that we use phosphoric acid for a lot of industrial purposes. they could take it and ammoniate it and then create MAP, which had a much higher phosphorus analysis than traditional rock phosphate. Rock phosphate was around 30%, MAP's around 52% for phosphorus analysis. The process, if you look at how we manufacture it, we go to areas like Florida that have like seabed recessions, that have a lot of bone structures in them. Essentially, you've got a high level of calcium phosphate. So they're going to dig out the rock, they're going to take it, put it in a slurry, and what they do is they hit it with acid, sulfuric acid. And what happens at that time is you end up with the phos acid on one side, and then you end up with the gypsum as a byproduct. Then we granulate it, and then we put it into the field. That's a chemistry process to separate it, to make the fertilizer. When we put it back into the soil is going to revert back to its chemistry form. So we talk about in a high pH situation, calcium is going to be your adverse reaction. In a low pH situation, it's aluminum and iron. And that process is going to fix back, so it's going to limit the availability. So when we talk about published single season availability, you'll see anywhere from 10 to 20%, sometime you'll see 10 to 30%. So we're talking about single season availability from it. So if you're putting out phosphorus, now bear in mind, within a season, and it depends on your soil type, there is a bank of phosphorus in the soil that the plant's accessing. But in terms of the amount of phosphorus that's available from MAP application, what stays soluble long enough for the plant to access, you're talking 10 to 20, 10 to 30%. And that really varies too on source. So if you took, we're talking the higher end spectrum here is in a neutral pH situation where you might have dry pea and dry soil. Dry pea and wet soil, that number drops. Liquid pea and dry soil is a little bit higher, but liquid pea and wet soil drops even more. So, you know, there's some areas that might have calcareous soil and you might get 10% of what you put on in terms of what's economically extractable in that instance. If we look at the dynamics of phosphorus, so we're talking about, we know the limited single season availability of pea in terms of how many pounds of pea are going to stay available to that crop and be extracted from that ton of fertilizer. We know there's limited mobility. So going back to the chemistry equation that we're talking about, we know there's calcium, obviously, calcium, aluminum, and iron are going to tie it up. Where do we typically apply our phosphorus? On the soil surface. So where those interactions occur limit the mobility of phosphorus. So phosphorus is not going to migrate in soils. That's why when you look at like environmental flare-ups and issues in areas, mainly a lot of that comes from a lot of phosphorus in the topsoil and a soil erosion that would occur, and then phosphorus gets into the water supply. So phosphorus is pretty immobile in the soil. We know that in the soil itself, there's a pool of phosphorus that's available in the soil to the plant. So what is in the soil in terms of your total P, and that's what we're talking about as being readily accessible to the crop, and that's what the plant can access through acids in its root system, and that's weakly bound phosphorus. So I'll show you, let me see if I'll mark it up here. So in the soil, you're going to have, let me pull this down. In the soil, you're basically, depending on what your soil structure is and what the historical, you're going to have clay particles in your soil that are negatively charged. Then whether you have aluminum or iron in the soil, you're going to have oxides. And those oxides are a coating on the outside of here. So they're a positively charged coating. And what happens to the pool of phosphorus that we're able to access in the soil is phosphorus, being negatively charged, will bind to these oxide structures here. That bond is what we call adsorbable, desorbable phosphorus in the soil. That is the phosphorus that the plant can access when the roots release organic acids. They'll free that up and allow phosphorus to come into solution. That P goes into orthophosphate form, just the same form that the fertilizer's in, and it gets pulled out of the soil. Then as the soil buffers that out, the P will actually fix back into unavailable form. That's why P cycles throughout the season in soils. So this number here that we're talking about, and it depends on your soil type, and there's obviously a large discrepancy depending on your management practices as well. If you're talking about situations where you've got a really strong root system, genetics come into play here, this number, you can access more of this pool. But that pool there that we're talking about, adsorbable, desorbable, is largely what shows up on soil tests. But then we have a wider amount of phosphorus in the soil, our total P, which has organic phosphorus compounds, as well as what we call precipitated or calcium phosphate in the soil that's really difficult for the plant to access. So we know on the front end that we are applying something with limited recovery. So I mean, it's not a very good currency exchange. If you were spending, $100 on something and only able to withdraw $10 at a time, it's not a very good transfer of efficiency. The challenge that we have is twofold. We have to make sure there's enough P in the soil, and we're showing a high enough soil test, because this recovery rate essentially is going to backfill how much we need during the cropping season. If we look at the importance of timing for phosphorus, and when we apply phosphorus fertilizer, it becomes a little bit more apparent. So I think we've all seen one of these charts before. This is from Nature's, and it talks about timing of P and when P is really important. So you can see the critical uptake period. So 75% of the total P mass removal for a corn crop comes after V10. So we tend to apply, in a lot of situations, we apply fertility in the fall or pre-season with limited availability. So what we're ending up with is a declining curve of availability when the crop needs more phosphorus uptake. So the amount of soluble phosphorus from our fertilizer is going down as we go through the season, but crop demand is going up. And some of the challenges that we have is making sure that we can close that window so that we can get enough P into the plant. Another critical time here is if you look at this in the first kind of 20 days of phosphorus, that doesn't seem like a lot of P, but if you compare that to plant mass at the time, it's a really high concentration of P efficiency. And I think, Jeremy, you talk about it, some of the best explanations around why it's important for a young seedling with P, so you can explain that as well. I mean, that's really relevant to the discussion.
Sure. So I've been in the ag industry for about 25 years, but the majority of all the time that I've spent in ag has been on the business side or relationship side. So products, for the most part, for me through my career, have just been widgets. And so I've been with AgroTech for about 10 months now. And when I started hearing James talk about this and talk about the product and seeing the results that we're getting with affecting P on corn, I'm the kind of guy, when I learn something, I don't want to just know the what. I want to know the why and the how. And so I just started digging into, why is this product and why is phosphorus affecting our corn yield the way that it is, and why is it that important? And what I landed on and what I learned, how many of you are familiar with what ATP is in a corn plant? So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency that corn uses, that any plant uses within their growth stage. And so when that corn seed is planted, it has enough ATP to start the germination. Okay? ATP is a nucleotide that has 3 groups of phosphate on the end, and it has to have those 3 groups before it can be used to create energy. Okay, when it burns that 3rd phosphate group off, it becomes ADP, which only has 2 phosphate groups. Okay, there are 2 times in a corn's life that it will actually burn so much energy that it uses 2 of those 3 phosphate groups and goes from a triple phosphate down to a monophosphate. And that's these 2 areas that James talked about. Okay, when are the 2 times in your corn's growth stage that you can affect yield the most? Both of those growth stages, emergence and when you start tasseling. I don't think it's a coincidence that those 2 overlap, that the 2 times that your corn plant uses the most phosphorus are the 2 times in the corn plant's life that you can affect yield the most. And so, we're not trying to be the bearer of bad news that not only in 2026 is phosphorus going to be the most expensive that it's ever been on the input. Also, we're telling you that phosphorus is the most inefficient, input that you're going to put on your corn crop. But it's also the input that can have the most negative or positive effects on your corn yield when you're putting it, down at the right timing. So, yeah, I just thought, why is phosphorus so important to corn, and why are we seeing these yields just affecting phosphorus? It is, I would argue that ATP and phosphorus at the right time in your corn plant is the #1 limiting factor in getting the full potential of your yield out of your corn hybrid.
It's really hard to catch up. Yeah, we know with corn, there's other nutrients that we can time and we can place to be able to catch up. We can foliar apply some nutrients. Phosphorus is not something you can catch up with in a foliar application. You could really only apply 0.2 to 0.5% of the total P requirements in a foliar application. What's really important is that we know when those peak periods are for uptake in phosphorus within the crop. But secondarily, we need to make sure that the nutrients that we're applying are available at that time. So with some of the chemistry challenges, and one of the things I always like to talk about is if we think about this being a chemistry problem and we go back to a farm application that we're all very familiar with right now. So something would be applying Roundup, yeah, something every farmer has done. So what do we do when we apply Roundup? What do we do with our water? We buffer it, yeah, we lower the pH, we adjust it. Why? Because hard water does what to Roundup? Limits the effectiveness of Roundup. Do we know why? So in Roundup, Roundup is a phosphate compound. And when we have a lot of calcium in our water, it binds to that Roundup, the glyphosate molecule, and makes the molecule too big to get into the plant. So what we'll do in that instance is we're paying for the chemistry to get efficacy in the field. We'll buffer our water. So we'll treat it with AMS, we'll do something to lower the pH to take calcium out of play so it doesn't react with the chemistry that we're applying to the field to make sure it goes into that same form. That same equation is happening in our soil, that exact same chemistry. And I'll show you a little example here of what that looks like. So we're going to simulate that same situation, but we're going to simulate it in terms of what happens to phosphorus in the soil. So I'm going to take just water here, and what I'll do is I'm going to load the water with calcium chloride. So I'm going to give it a high calcium level. So this is bottled water. It's probably pretty similar to neutral pH. It's not one of those fancy alkaline waters that Jeremy drinks, but I'm going to add calcium chloride to this water. And I just want to show you the chemistry side of things. So we mentioned that same chemistry in a spray tank. This is the chemistry that affects phosphorus fertilizer in your soil. So I'm going to add the same amount to both of these jugs here. Stir this up. Make sure it's mixed in. And then I will do the same thing to this one here. So we've got two. And it might be a little bit hard to see from back here, but I'll pass it around so you can see it. Okay, so same concentration. All right. Okay, so now we've simulated a high calcium situation, which we know phosphate reacts. And this is a little bit accelerated to be able to show it. Otherwise, if I put a really small amount, you wouldn't see a precipitate. So I've got 1034O here, so just liquid 1034O. So I'm going to add 10 drops of 1034O into one of these. And what I want you to pay attention to is the chemical reaction that's occurring when I do this. So I'll see if I can hold this up against here. So, 1, 2. You see that? Can everyone see that? All right. So that reaction that's occurring there, what do you think that is? It's calcium phosphate. Remember what I said, how we extract phosphorus fertilizer from the soil? This reaction that occurs is the same reaction that occurs in your soil. So when we apply phosphorus to our soil in a really, say it's a high pH, so anything above 7, and we're adding phosphorus into the soil and there's calcium, you're getting what's called precipitation in the soil. This precipitation is a very hard thing to reverse. The only thing that can reverse this is really strong acid. And our plant roots in the soil can't effectively access calcium phosphate, which is that total P piece in the soil that we're going to talk about a bit when we talk about soil tests. So this part here, when we talk about the 10 to 20% availability within the soil from fertility, this is the loss. This builds a bank. Now, over time, over a long period of time, there are fractions of this that break down because P cycles in the soil, and there is some acidity that is strong enough in the root zone to access it, but not very efficiently. So this is the chemical reaction. So when we talked about how we address our spray water when we're addressing herbicides to avoid this, the reason we have to avoid that is because if you had a Roundup molecule and it bound to calcium, that's too big to get in the leaf surface. So we take calcium out of play. If I was to add a lot of acid to this same reaction and use it, then you would have a clear solution, and I'll show you something a little bit later that will do that. So again, really important when we talk about the true problem that stems with phosphorus fertilizer is a chemistry problem first. The biological system is our access to phosphorus, and we can improve the recovery rate in the soil by focusing on good soil pH, good biological systems, because the plant's roots is how it accesses phosphorus in the soil. When we talk about this access pull from phosphorus, so how is the plant accessing phosphorus? So we know, and I'll go, maybe we can do it here, I'll do it on the next slide, I'll show you here. So let's look at corn. We'll go back to corn, for example. Okay, so corn plant. We know, as we discussed before, it takes up phosphorus all the way through the R7. We know 75% is after V10. We know it's really difficult to make up the phosphorus in a foliar application. So what is that access point of phosphorus in the soil? So how is the plant accessing phosphorus? So in the root zone, you're going to have, say we draw a root system here, and I'm not a very good drawer, okay? So what happens is there's biology in the soil. So the plant says I need phosphorus and it needs a nutrient. The plant's going to release a food source to the biology that's in the soil. So we've got our biology here, okay? That biology is going to give something back, and what it does to do that is it delivers a release of acid, so a low molecule acid. That acid, like we had in that diagram before, is bringing P into solution. So the bigger root system that we have for our crop, and the healthier root system, paired with appropriate pH management in our soil, that is where most of the phosphorus is coming to the crop. It's not actually coming from the fertilizer, because if you think about it, 100 pounds of P applied, for example, at a 10% availability, you're getting 10 pounds of soluble P within that season. If we go back to that growth chart that I was talking about before, take a 200 bushel corn crop. A 200 bushel corn crop, say anywhere from 0.35 to 0.4 pounds of P per bushel. So at 0.4 pounds of P per bushel for corn at 200, it removes 80 pounds of P. So if we have 80 pounds of P is the removal rate in that season, and our fertility is known to give us 10 pounds of soluble P, where's the rest of the P coming from? It's coming from this reaction in the soil. This is why it's so important that we focus on having a really healthy root system and make sure that there's enough. This rhizosphere here is the most important thing for a crop to access P from the soil. Now, if your pH is not right, that makes this equation a lot harder because phosphorus becomes more tightly bound in the soil. If you go up and say you have a pH of 8, the strength of that bond that we have here with calcium phosphate becomes stronger. The closer you get to neutral soils, the easier it is to do. The same thing with low pH soils. Low pH soils, your problem's going to be aluminum and iron, and when they bind together, it's really hard to break them free. So that's on corn. We often think about soybeans as well. So we know soybeans take up phosphorus and peak uptake somewhere around R3. All right, 87% of it's after R1. So what we're trying to show here is that, and it makes sense because mass removal, you've got a bigger plant, the plant's going to remove more from the soil. Do we know one of the functions that phosphorus is really important for in soybeans, which a lot of people don't know, is so what do we think the most important nutrient on soybeans is in the room? You guys use a lot of potassium on soybeans? Is that part of your management plan? Potassium? Yep. We know that nitrogen's really important because see this nodulation here? That's fixing nitrogen to that plant. It takes 16 molecules of ATP to fix 1 unit of atmospheric nitrogen. So 16 molecules of ATP. He talked about ATP earlier, and phosphorus is a big driver of ATP production. If you're deficient in phosphorus, your ability to be able to fix enough nitrogen for the soybean crop drops. And it's not something that we look at on soybeans a lot because they're a secondary crop and it's really hard to move the needle. And sometimes we'll chase tissue test analysis in here and we'll look for P sufficiency levels, but an actual true indicator too is, are you getting enough nitrogen into the plant? So if you can get enough available phosphorus to that plant, then what you can do is you can actually end up increasing the nitrogen content of a soybean plant. Another really important relationship that we have in the root zone, and this is a better one to show, is you have the natural plant roots, okay? In your soil, who's got clay soil here? Anyone have clay soils? Okay, all right. Have you seen what happens when plant roots hit clay? Yeah, I mean, there's not enough pressure that they can exert to get in there. I don't know the exact number for pounds of square foot pressure. Someone said it the other day, I don't know where he got it, but it's a pretty high number to be able to penetrate the clay. There is something in the soil that can penetrate it. It's called AMF. So mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. So they're natural in your soils and you can add some in to stimulate it. But if you ever broken apart some clay and you see a little bit of white in there, those white fibers are AMF. They're really important in clay soils because what it means is if you've got this clay particle here, AMF root hairs are so small they can grow into the pores of that clay structure. So when we think about phosphorus efficiency, and we know that our roots have to come in contact with phosphorus, it's super important that we have different types of root systems, because if we're going to access more P in our soil, we need to make sure we're covering as much surface area as possible, because P's not moving towards the root of the crop. So AMF is something that we should look at, and we should think, if you pull apart your root hairs and you don't see a lot of white, it kind of looks like white fungus in there or something when you break it apart, then you know you don't have a really solid AMF count. And there's actually some tests that you can do, Alex, that will show you where your AMF levels are. And it's not a tremendously expensive application. When you think about the fact that this plant is trying to access what it needs from P, if you can grow into these other areas, there's phosphorus to be able to pull that P out. Now what we're going to look at, we're going to talk about soil testing. This is the really important part to understand how we look at phosphorus. So the Mehlich test was developed in 1980, okay? And what the Mehlich test was, a group of scientists got together and they said, and they didn't do it for a crop, so everyone I think in the room can agree that different crops have different root systems. We know that root systems access phosphorus. So a corn crop's ability to be able to access phosphorus is different than a soybean and a wheat crop. They didn't do it crop specific. So they just said, we're going to try and figure out in a 24-hour period what's the total amount of acidity that we can put into the soil. And what they did is they used acetic acid, EDTA, and different acid mixtures, and they calibrated it against the fertilizer application rate to get a yield response. So when you get your Mehlich 3 soil test back, it's giving you a pool of P theoretically accessible to the plant through acidity in the root zone, based on genetics back in the day. So what do we know about genetics on corn now and yield? We know they're going up every single year. If you compare corn yields in the early 80s versus today in Iowa, you might be at 130 bushel and now we're at 200 bushel. Well, we're removing so much more phosphorus from the soil and we're fertilizing based upon old yield. Now, I'm not bashing soil tests. Soil tests are critically important for us to understand where our baseline levels at. The challenge that we have in this situation is, if you think about this, so if we've been fertilizing for removal rate based upon numbers developed back in the day, but our yields have been going up, what does that mean? We must be pulling P from somewhere else in the soil. So today's genetics have a much more efficient root system, and what they're able to do is access this phosphorus from other areas that aren't accessible. And when we talk about those other areas, let's look at this. So we have what's considered our total P in our soil in a test. So your total P is going to take 3 pools of phosphorus. It's going to take this pool, it's going to take an organic pool of phosphorus as well, your organic phosphorus here in the soil, and your total P is going to have your calcium phosphate in there. So you have 3 pools. So organic P. Does anyone use livestock manure on their farm? Anyone use hog manure, livestock manure? Okay, so livestock, if you're using hog manure might be 60% inorganic P, 40% organic P. It's a tremendous source of phosphorus fertilizer because you've got 2 forms of phosphorus. You've got potassium, you've got nitrogen, you've got everything balanced in there. So this organic P, say you've got 2% organic matter in your soil, okay? This organic P, the only way for this organic phosphorus to get to the plant is through enzymes. So enzymes are what biology produces in the soil. So penicillin biology will produce phosphatase enzymes. Those enzymes will take organic P and convert it into inorganic P, the same P that our fertilizer's in. Remember, anytime the plant accesses phosphorus and brings it back in, anytime enzymes access phosphorus and bring it back in, it's in the same form as our fertilizer that we apply to the soil. In this form, it's still subject to tie up back in the soil, and that's why P cycles throughout the year. It's in and out of available form. What we need to make sure is that this cycle is big enough so that when that plant needs it, there's not a huge gap between what it needs and what the soil can supply. So there are some things we can do to increase this efficiency. This is really important. The amount of P you can get out of it, say at 2% organic matter might have 140 pounds of P in it per acre. So you might have 140 pounds of P, which sounds great. You got 140 pounds of P. But a natural enzyme conversion in the soil might be, say, 0.5% to 2%. So you might get, what, 2.8 pounds of P out of there at best from that. Now, if you've got 10% organic matter, that number comes up substantially. So this is a pool of phosphorus that you can access. The higher organic matter you have in your soil, or the more organic phosphorus you're adding, this number goes up, which adds to this number and gives you what you need. This part here, a lot of it is, sorry, my handwriting's horrible, calcium phosphate. This is what we call our legacy P. It's the P that's not strong enough. We have to be accessing some of this though, and that's what I'm trying to say, is that based upon our soil tests and where our yield's going, our plant is a lot more efficient than we give it credit for in accessing. We're getting more than what just shows up on our Malick test. Has anyone done a P response study on their farm before? Have you altered P application rates? Lowered them? Have you skipped them? Have you lowered? Yeah? Okay, when you lowered your P application rates, did you notice an impact on yield? Okay. University of Minnesota has a study that they showed that said there is no difference to yield on corn if you apply phosphorus in the fall and the spring. What do you think that tells us about phosphorus? If we know it ties up, we show that it's really inefficient, even if we apply it in the spring and the fall. So our whole theory on soil testing is correct. We have to build a bank, because the bigger the bank, the more 2% or 5% looks like that comes out for your crop. There is also another thing when you look at this study, and I think it's University of Iowa did a study where they ran consecutive crops on corn to see what would happen to P soil test levels. They saw that the Malick levels kind of went up and down and dropped a little bit, but what happened to yield? Yield didn't drop. So plants are really effective at accessing phosphorus in the soil. What we need to look at are ways in terms of, there's different ways to make phosphorus more efficient. So we know placement's important. So, you know, if phosphorus wasn't inefficient, yeah, we wouldn't see a benefit to applying it in furrow on corn crops. We apply phosphorus in furrow because what we're trying to do is we're really trying to, if you take that furrow slice here, we're trying to maximize the amount of P that's here to overcome all of these chemistry challenges that are here, hoping that there's enough P to get to that seedling at that one time. That's why banding fertility or banding in a strip till application, you get higher P efficiency rates, rather than if we just broadcast it across the surface, because we know that it doesn't move very much. So in order for that plant root to access it, it has to get close enough to the phosphorus to access. There's some other things we can do in this. We talked about we can increase the biology in that soil profile. So what are some really good ways for us to promote native soil biology? So obviously adjusting pH, making sure compaction's not a big issue on your farm as well. That will help biological activity. We know that we can add a food source for the biology. So when we think about it, things like sugars and humics and those types of products are really good at promoting the natural biology within the soil. Remember, we're trying to build the biggest, most efficient engine we can. We really have to focus on getting the biggest root system we can with the best amount of food so that it can basically tap into this pool of phosphorus that we're trying to access. What are some other ways that we look at adjusting fertilizer efficiency? So right now you can go out and you could buy maize. So maize has sulfur in it. Yeah? What does sulfur do? Sulfur lowers the pH. What's that do? In the same situation, lowering the pH will give you a little bit of time that will extend that release of phosphorus to the plant. That release is short-lived though, because it just depends on how long it takes for that soil pH to buffer that out, and then phosphorus will then lock back into the soil. We can do different things in terms of our sources of pea fertilizer. So one of the things that you'll see is people will tell you on the starter market, they'll say ortho or polyphosphate starter fertilizer. So you've got some companies that'll say poly's more available. You'll say some companies say that ortho's more available. Well, polyphosphate converts to ortho in the soil anyway, because the plant has to take it up in orthophosphate form. So poly will just delay it, maybe 24 hours, 48 hours, it could be 72 hours, but eventually it will all convert. But that time period there might help keep more phosphorus available at the time. Or you might want more ortho P up front when you need that little bit of P at the beginning. The main difference between those fertilizer sources is just the type of micronutrients that you have to add. Poly's really good at sequestering micronutrients, so you don't have to use EDTA in it. And ortho, you have to use EDTA in. So I always say when looking at starter fertilizer sources, if you guys use them, just look for the highest quality in terms of the highest analysis at the best price. Because at the end of the day, what we're after is just as many pounds of orthophosphate in that soil zone for that plant to access at the time. So this is a little bit on the phosphorus side of things. Are there any questions about phosphorus or soil testing?
How big of an impact does sodium levels have on, you mentioned that 1/8 moves 1/8 of an inch.
Yeah.
What is this, like if you have a high sodium level in your soils, how does that affect the availability?
So sodium's really important because sodium changes the osmotic pressure around the root. So it does affect the plant's ability to be able to take in water. And when it affects the plant's ability to take in water, it affects the plant's ability to take in nutrients. I think that's really important. Now, you have to bear in mind, is it saline soils or is it sodic soils? So is it sodium, the cation, or saline, which comes from an anion form? So do you have an issue with sodium in your soils?
Well, I've started soil testing by soil type and
Okay.
testing for sodium.
Sodium.
So, yeah, I'm seeing that pop up in a lot of our soil types.
Okay. So
I've just started doing that this way, so that's kind of wild.
do you think is it coming from a water supply? Is it just inherent in your soils?
I think it's just inherent.
Okay. So it's important to look if it's saline sodic or sodic soils. And those are the two things that I would look first to find out, because there's different ways to manage them. If you have a lot of sodium in your soil, so like a lot of sodium in your soil, so sodium, calcium, free calcium can displace sodium, and you can move it with irrigation and rainwater. Saline's a little bit different of a situation, and typically that happens a lot of waterlogged clay soils. You might have saline sodic soils. They're a little bit more difficult to manage because you got to make sure that you have somewhere for it to go. Because if you displace it, it doesn't move. So, there's some ways that you can manage it, but you're 100% correct. If you've got a lot of sodium, it affects that plant root's ability to access water, changes the osmotic pressure around the root zone. So if you're not taking in water, you're not taking in nutrients really effectively. Any other questions on the P side of things? or the soil testing side of things.
How many pounds are actually there?
I mean, that's a really good question. So, you know, there is some studies, and I can pull one up after and show you guys. It's been really difficult to understand what the value of this legacy P. We tend to call part of this total P legacy P. It's all that calcium phosphate in the soil. Like, how many pounds are truly there? Well, we know in a general consensus in different situations that your malic here can represent, you know, 20 to 30% of your total P. So if you do the math, if you've got a malic of 30, you do the backwards math, you understand how much total P you have in the soil. But there's even parts of P that aren't accessible just with traditional soil testing methods, and those can be even higher. I think Brazil's the only country in the world where they took like an X-ray spectrophotometer on their soil, and they looked at all the different types of phosphorus, and they estimated there was so much phosphorus in there that they couldn't see within a soil test. Remember, as we talked about with our soil test before, our soil test is just applying a theoretical amount of acidity into the soil. So that's why I go back to the fact that I think we're not giving our hybrids enough credit today in terms of what they're able to access. And that's why, you know, I like to look at soil tests as a good baseline here, but I think there's some ways that we can access more of that P outside of that, because this is just predicting yield response based upon efficiency of fertilizer as well. And we know there are ways that we can make our fertilizer more efficient. So who knows what will happen. I think Pete Labs have tried to do this. I think Ward Labs does a Haney test now. And the Haney test takes in biological activity and everything to give you a different amount of P that's there. I would say just I wouldn't get too hung up on, well, let's just take this. We can think about building our soils now, but with fertilizer prices where they are, what's the point of building something we get very limited access to? I think that 2 to 5% number that we're talking about back here, when we talk about, you know, 2 to 5% or whatever the total number might be of the soil, I think if you do the math on it, if we increase this, yeah, then the removal rate that we're getting is way more than the build rate that we're putting into our soils. There was a really interesting study that was done in the UK. So there were a bunch of farmers in the UK that had a lot of runoff issues. So the environmentalists said, hey, you got to stop using phosphorus fertilizer. So what they did in the UK at the time is they ran a study. So the farmers said, hey, they said to the farmers, look, if you've got, I don't know exactly what the numbers were, but say you got 60 ppm of P, you can apply 0 P. These farmers were like, we can walk out into our crops and we can see phosphorus deficiencies. You're telling us we've got a lot of phosphorus in the soil, but our crop needs phosphorus. And they were saying, no, you can't apply phosphorus. So what the farmers did is they banded together and they did a P rundown study. So they grew the same crop on the ground and they tried to see if they could run down the soil test levels. The levels didn't really drop. So, because remember, P was cycling back and forth in the soil between these. So it's constantly mobilizing and changing its form. And for the soil test thing, it wasn't showing them that they were depleting it massively. And that goes back to your point before when you said, you've cut back phosphorus rates and you haven't seen an impact on yield. Now, traditional, how do I say this politely, people will tell you that sell fertilizer to you that you're taking a risk by depleting your bank. I think the bigger risk is adding to the bank and not being able to extract it, because that's currency at the end of the day, and that affects profitability for farmers. It's really important that we can get more access to what we've invested in. You've already invested in it. Almost every farmer here has been applying phosphorus dry for a long time to their soil. So you've been adding to this bank. So if we know that the bank gives us a very low withdrawal rate, is it not smart to start thinking about how we get more out of what we paid for in the first place rather than adding more into an inefficient situation? It's really interesting with phosphorus. Phosphorus is the one thing, if you think about it, like MAP was developed in the 70s, and we've been applying MAP, DAP, TSP, single super, all of this to the soil to a certain amount of time. But I mean, our efficiency on it is it's one of the least efficient things that we do fertility-wise on a farm. Or anything. I mean, you wouldn't buy any seed from Beck's if it had a 10% germination rate, or you buy a lot of seed from Beck's because it had a 10% germination rate. So, I mean, that's the thing to start thinking about. Like, what do we think about nitrogen efficiency? So what do we do now with nitrogen? we know in tough situations you might lose 40% of your nitrogen. So what do we do now? We put stabilizers in it and we look at addressing loss to get more out of it. Well, nitrogen prices against phosphorus prices are really high. So we need to look at ways with phosphorus to make it much more efficient. And there are. And I will say, like, this is the thing that you have to be aware of. It's not a one product, it's not a one fix. It's a systems approach. So we talked about before the importance of biology. So make sure your biology is right. And then there's a chemistry approach too. So people, I think, that are going to do really well that we've seen have paired chemistry and biology together to access it. And that's what's giving them the most out of this whole P equation. Anything else on the P side of things? Okay. So what are some chemistry options that you can utilize to address phosphorus? And I'll talk about something that we developed. So we developed a patent on a molecule, and basically what the molecule does is we're talking about phosphorus. So we all know in the soil that phosphorus is negatively charged. Okay, so if you think about think about this in a real simple sense. It's like magnets. Okay, your soil has a lot of positively charged magnets. Phosphorus is a negative charge. When you go into the soil, they're going to bind together. It's exactly what happened in this situation here. So in order to change that equation, what can we do? So we take the theory, and the easiest way to explain it is P is negatively charged. We know P is negatively charged. Okay, so we created a patent on a chemical compound that has a strong negative charge, a really big one. So we have a CEC of 1200. So what's the highest soil CEC in the room? Probably 10, 20. Okay, so really high CEC and really large size. So what this thing is if you looked at it, it looks like a bunch of attachment points like this. Okay, they're all negatively charged and they can all interact with positive charged nutrients in the soil. Each one of these molecules here on the plant can control 62 times its weight in calcium. So 62 times its weight in calcium. So when we apply phosphorus, which is a negative charge to the soil, and we know what happens if we don't protect it, and then we apply this together with it, what this does is it takes the calcium out of play at a high pH. Takes the calcium onto it and leaves it there. But it's free calcium. The plant can still access that calcium. And remember, we're only talking about adding ounces of this product per acre, because all we really care about is this micro environment. Everything directly around that granule is the important thing to understand. So I'm going to show you what would happen. I'll show you something else here. So I'll give you a demo of what happens when we apply something with it to be able to basically take that out of play. So I'm going to add some of the product into water. So let me add.
Don't spill it in here.
Yeah, that would be it's not coming off the warehouse floor for a while. Come on. Let's go. I'm losing suction on my. I didn't get enough in there. Wait, hold on. All right. So. It's not enough. Okay. All right, so I've mixed what we're talking about into the water now. So now what I'm going to do is do the same thing. And now bear in mind, it's not going to get rid of 100% of it because nothing's going to fix it. But I want to show you something, and afterwards you can have a look at this. So I'm going to add in the same 10 drops. Okay. And I'll mix this up. And then we'll let this sit. And you'll see in a bit. So at the end, you'll see what this does. So this, if it's doing its job from a chemistry standpoint, what it's going to do is it's going to keep that calcium away from the phosphorus and precipitate. So it's going to sequester the calcium in there. And you'll see, I'll pass it around in 5 minutes, you'll see. More calcium held apart means there's more free phosphorus in this. So if we go into a soil situation, there's more phosphorus that's in the same form as the fertilizer that's available to the plant. It's really critical that we keep more phosphorus that we're applying from reacting in the soil, Because remember, we said this is a chemistry issue within our soil first, okay? The next thing that this product is really unique in doing is we talked about how phosphorus migrates. So the biology produces acidity, which delivers phosphorus to the plant. That phosphorus, though, is in the same form as this. And what we now know with a product like this, or this product and other products, is that if you can do the same thing here in the root zone, then what you can do is, even without fertility, if it's put on seed or put in furrow, you can actually make that plant more efficient at accessing phosphorus in the soil. So we can show that when we use chemistry together with biology, we're able to access a lot more of the phosphorus from the soil. So remember that 2 to 5%, okay? If we can take this number and do two things to it, yeah? We can increase this recovery rate, because if we focus on biology and we get it here, then what we're going to do, and we've got the data to show it, is we're going to keep that phosphorus there longer. So rather than P cycling in and out and in and out, we're going to allow it to pool. And why does that matter? Because if we go back to our very beginning, and we go back to the very beginning here, why does that matter? If we've got something in here working this whole time, when this soil is releasing it and we're keeping it there, then the gap between what the plant needs and what the soil can provide it is smaller. And what does that look like? So if we look at it in a research standpoint, so we've done tests, and we've done a lot of tests with phosphate producers. That's who's validated a lot of our technology, from in Russia with Phosagro to the States to Simplot. So you'll see that it's able to, this basically just shows you that in a lab setting, when they make things really difficult, that we can stop calcium phosphate, aluminum phosphate, and iron phosphate, which means we can work at a high pH and we can work in a low pH soil in terms of stopping these fixation reactions. So if you did this in a low pH with aluminum, you get a very similar reaction. We also know, and the one thing that we've done, and we did probably one of the most involved studies to look at the impact of what phosphorus was throughout the season. So this is really interesting, because typically before, when we had done research, we just said, how do you explain phosphorus efficiency? We'll do 100% of the fertilizer, then we'll cut it to 50% of the fertilizer, and then we'll cut it to 20, and then we'll see what the yield does. Well, as you know earlier on, I mean, what's that showing us? Yeah, theoretically it's showing us that we're getting more because we're increasing the yield, but how do we isolate that it's phosphorus? Because if you just cut out phosphorus, it didn't impact yield, well then, what was the point of spending money on a product? Because you could have just cut out phosphorus and got the same yield anyway. So what we did is, this researcher, he's been able to validate a testing method. So this was a really large-scale field trial replicated. And what he did is he took these lysimeters, so it basically suction tubes, and he put them all throughout the field in each repetition. And then zinc. That's why this product itself has zinc, manganese, sulfur. And basically what we wanted to do in the research is run the same study. So we talked about before, we ran the study, so we ran this on seed with 0 fertility, and what did we see? Over the first 28 days, there was more P available than if we put starter in there. Remember, starter is very inefficient. It's going to bind liquid and wet soils. That reaction starts very quickly. So what we were doing is we were taking what the plant was doing itself and just making it more accessible, which is a much more sustainable way of doing it. And it's a more cost-effective way. We know we've tested the research on this. We looked at replicated trial sites where we would run a starter, add NutriCharge to the starter. We knew we'd get an effect, but we pulled the starter out altogether and just used this, and we got a very similar starter response. So I think, you know, across the country, we've had very good luck with it. It's an easy application method. It's not an expensive application if you were to compare it against a starter fertilizer. You know, the product, this is what the product looks like. You can pass it around. But, you know, for something that costs $6 an acre but helps you deliver a lot of P, $6 to $10 an acre to deliver a lot of P, it's just showed really good ability to get early season emergence. Yeah, don't put too much of it on you. You'll get all glittery. Yeah. So what are some other, if you think about, now we've talked about taking this from a fall application and moving it to a spring application, making enough difference in our fall laps to move into the spring and promote efficiency. So what's a good systems approach or what's a good pair? So like with what we like to see and when we get the best out of it is if you have in furrow, put something in furrow. If you don't have in furrow, use something like this. Use a humic for sure. A humic and a sugar source. Those are two really proven things at being able to activate biology. Our ability to be able to impact yield is determined on the ability of you to be able to build a big root system. If you can build a successful root system with biology, you're giving us more fertility to protect, and we can have a very good result. Now, we talked about the fact that we talked about this pool of phosphorus. So this is something interesting. So the last 3 years, and something that will be in that product next year, is we talked about the fact that hydroxyapatite is really difficult to break. So we had a product that we were doing research on that was really interesting is we take citric acid, it's a strong acid. We'd put it in water at 2 pounds and we'd band it in the soil and we could show that we could pull 30 to 40 pounds of P out of the soil. Citric will do it. A strong enough acid will take, remember that third pool of P we said was inaccessible? Citric acid is strong enough to break apart calcium phosphate. If I was to take 1 drop of citric and put it back in here and shake it up, it would be all gone. It would just be clear again. So we did that and we knew that we could do it. Then we put NutriCharge with it and we knew we could keep it available longer and it was a very good product. The only problem is that you're having to buy a lot of citric acid and by the time you put the cost of citric in, you might as well just put fertilizer in the soil. So that's the issue that we had with it. So we worked the last 3 years in developing something. So in this product now, we're going to have an acidifying agent in there that's really efficient at pushing hydrogen and low molecular weight acids. And the interesting thing about it is, remember, we're trying to get more P in solution. So triphase for us, and this shows you the effect of it. So this is just standard soil, this is standard hydroxyapatite release. And when we've added this acidifying agent to it, look how much P we're driving out of there. So this is really, in our research, this is what's most exciting to us because we want this to be that third pool. So if we can validate this and continue, and this year the results look as good as they did last year, then what this enables us to do is we can start to tap into that total P. So that other chart here with all this calcium phosphate in it, that's going to make a difference because that there is currency beneath your feet that you can't access. And the other really important thing about this is this acid dissolves zinc oxide, which we know is not available. So we can bring zinc and phosphorus into ratio. We can put this in there. We get it in and around. We're just getting currency from another area of the soil that we haven't had access to. So when I mean we've screened, because we want products, we've screened everything in the market. Not everything, but close to it. Enzymes, biology, humics, fulvics, amino acids, everything to see, like what is going to drive the most amount of phosphorus for us to do. And this product here is the one that's going to deliver us the most amount of P that's not accessible to the plant. So again, this will be an application that in terms of cost of P, I mean, it would be less than pound of P cost per acre to be able to access a wider pool of P in the soil. So we're really looking forward to releasing this next year. So where's the second window that we like to apply our product? So we know if we go back to our corn chart here, since we're jumping back and forth, we know that we want to impact this P period right here. So how can we impact the P period here and how can we extend it out to here? What's one thing a lot of us do is side dress. So we side dress applications, side dress or wide drop applications. So our second window that we really like to hit is in that side dress window or wide drop window because we're getting it in another area in the soil. We applied it here. If we can get it here, we can do that. We've been able to show in these wide drop apps that we've been able to increase tissue content of P late season. There's another benefit to this that we don't market here because we can't. Technically, to be a stabilizer in the States, you have to be a bactericide. So in Europe, we did some testing, and if you think about what's happening, remember we said NutriCharge is negatively charged. What form of nitrogen is positively charged? Ammonium. Ammonium is positively charged. So if we can hold nitrogen and ammonium form longer in the soil, then we delay the conversion. And in low CEC soils, this is really prevalent because your main problem with loss in low CEC soils is not volatility. So we know that in Europe, we're registered as a stabilizer. we know it'll work as well as DMPP and very similar to DCD, but with no effect on soil biology. Because at the end of the day, all we're doing chemistry. Here's one thing about phosphorus availability they want to bring up. Who thinks that the form of nitrogen that they're using impacts phosphorus availability? Or who would have thought about that in the past? So ammonium nitrogen, when the plant utilizes it in the soil and it converts, releases hydrogen. And what's hydrogen do? Lowers the pH, which means the type of nitrogen that you're using in the predominant form that's in the soil can actually impact your phosphorus availability as well. So it's really interesting to think about. So with us, we know that this is a fact, and we've seen this, and we've got great results with it. I mean, this will show you a study in terms of its impact on nitrate. So this is at IRF in Yuma, Colorado, and what they did is they ran ion control probes in the soil, and they measured the amount of nitrate that was in there, and they were running 180 pounds of N, 6 10-gallon applications through a center pivot in pure blow sand. And they were measuring the total nitrate levels in the soil. Well, this is the control, and these are all the treatments that we had through there. So we were holding more ammonium at plant in ammonium form. So ammonium is really important. We know it can impact phosphorus availability, but ammonium in high stress conditions is an easier form of nitrogen for plants to use. If you're in a high stress or heat stress or drought stress, and a plant's trying to use nitrate, it has to convert it back in the plant, which takes energy. So you can actually use less nitrogen overall if you've got more ammonium in the soil. So this is an interesting thing that we've been able to see when we put it in a side dress app is we're getting more P availability because we know we're cycling in a different root zone. We know we're keeping more nitrogen in a form that impacts P availability, and then you can do this. So what most people do is they'll take the cost of the stabilizer out of that side dress app, because this will do a very similar thing to it, but you get the benefit of phosphorus long term. And then the other thing that we've been looking at, and this is pure discovery at the moment, is there is in Illinois in the Central Valley of California, we have a lot of customers that we've done work with in the past, and we've always been chasing phosphorus.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Back to that.
Yeah.
What you were just talking about.
Yeah.
So would that replace like humic?
So humic, I would still add humic in there. The humic stabilization part of it is not going to be as strong as like a DCD, but a humic is a really good addition. Like we always like to pair humics with it because it's another food source in the right area. Yeah, it will lower some of the burn constant of like a 32 or something like that. I would still be using humic. This would be if you were using a pure stabilizer like a DCD or a DMPP. We like the humic in combination with what we're doing because it's such a good food source in the soil. We noticed that there's a lot of people that have really high, and I'm not sure if anyone in the room has these clay soils that will trap a lot of potassium. So they'll show really high potassium on a soil test, and then when it comes to available period, there's very little potassium. Well, there is a part of the US, there's 2 regions that have what they call this 2-to-1 clay in their soils. And what 2-to-1 clay means is usually there's a lot of, usually you have potassium is a really small molecule. So you have all these lattice structures in the soil. And what happens is when potassium gets into those lattice structures and it dries out, it traps the potassium. So that's why you'll see, if you're ever running a water test or something, you'll see K levels high. And then as you go through wet drying periods, all of a sudden you're running into K deficiencies. And originally when we were running this product, we were asking people like, what are you seeing about phosphorus? And this is up through Minnesota, through Illinois, and then in California we had the same thing. Like phosphorus, we're seeing normal things, but we can't figure out what's going on with potassium. So we said, all right, well, let's run this test and let's have a look at it. So we took a farm, so this is in La Harpe, Illinois, a farm that farmers had a really hard problem with potassium for a long time. He was one of our dealers' customers. And he would side dress liquid KCl in season. He'd just try and do whatever he could to be able to get potassium availability. So we just wanted to see if there was an effect. So he took the same soil, we ran it through a replicated study in a lab, and what they did is they just treated it with the NutriCharge. And what it showed is over the 3 dates, this is the difference in available potassium that there was. So why is this happening? Because we always want to understand a why. It's really important to understand a why. So when we talk about, there's 2 things that happen here. So when we talk about negative Potassium, we know potassium is positively charged. Okay? We know our positives negatively, polymer is negatively charged, so we can impact it. But we also know that our polymer likes to draw moisture to it as well. So you end up with two things. You end up with a more hydrated area, which means that there's less pressure for it to collapse. And we can keep some of this potassium off of that clay structure, which means if it's off the clay structure, then we can keep it available to the plant. So this will be a really interesting piece of research that we look to do, and I would expect as we get more and more into Illinois, I would anticipate probably there's a significant portion of yield that actually comes from the potassium piece, because it is a challenge in some areas. So again, this isn't like, it's kind of hard, and sometimes when I sit up here and I talk about it, I'm like, yeah, we work on phosphorus, but then there's a benefit to nitrogen and potassium. You're like, well, you know, what doesn't it do, kind of a thing. But theoretically, it just has to do with the chemistry. So being negatively charged and being able to interact with cations, we can influence other cations in the soil in a positive way. So these are things that we're looking at and we'll continue to research and put into place, but we always like to point this out because being in Illinois, there are issues with potassium. Okay. All right. Well, to kind of wrap up on this, and then I'll take this off and we can just chat. So what we're talking about here is there's three main points. Okay. So the first point that we're talking about is just making everybody aware about phosphorus efficiency as dry phosphorus and liquid phosphorus is there. We've talked about the fact about our soil testing, how to be able to predict response, but I think the bigger thought here is starting to think about how we take these different pools of phosphorus that we have in our soil, our organic, our adsorbable phosphorus, and then our total P, and trying to get more access out of them. So what we know in these forms here, so in our total P, so is this is where all the investment on the farm has gone into building this bank of soil. So what we're looking at is two things. One, we want to make sure that the conversion of this 2 to 5%, so this number here becomes higher. So what's the best way to make the recovery higher? We know based upon low efficiency on the front end, it's not to increase that. In today's market, that is not economically advisable because we're adding a small amount in, to this situation. The best way that we can focus on this is by addressing the root system, of addressing a healthy crop to be able to access more P. Because the more we access of this big number, and who knows what that number is, say it's 300-400 pounds an acre in that total P. This at 5% of 300-400 pounds to make up the deficiency between what the fertilizer we're applying and not is a lot greater. The other thing that we talked about is if we can take this number here and improve it on the way up and double the efficiency of P using chemistry, which we talked about, then we could do one or two things, We know what that crop's going to remove based upon what our yield goal is and based upon 0.4 pounds per bushel. We can redistribute that savings by lowering our fertility on this side into systems that access this on the front end, or we can do both. We can protect what's coming in and enhance what's going out. So if anything that's come out of this talk today is just trying to make you aware of phosphorus dynamics. So we know it's a really inefficient thing in our soil, and there are ways that we can manage this. We know genetics are doing a better job of it. So if we can pair better products with the genetics, then what we're going to do is get closer to achieving the yield potential of the crop because phosphorus is not going to be a limiting factor. There are corn growers in the States, and we see these high yield guys that are out there, and they throw everything at a crop, literally everything. They throw as much P, they run it in different applications. Do you know what the one thing that they always talk about that's limiting their yield is phosphorus? They know that when they pull tissue tests towards reproduction, that phosphorus is always low. And they're applying more than enough phosphorus. I mean, they're running phosphorus in multiple applications. These guys have started to look at things a little bit differently now, and they've gone from all dry programs to mainly all liquid programs. And when they went to all liquid programs, the total amount of nutrition that they're applying was actually less, but it wasn't impacting yields. Yields were going up. So it is a challenge, and there are ways to manage it, and we just have to look at what's a systems approach. That's the one thing I will say. Not one thing will get you closer to it, but a combination of both chemistry and biology, I think, is the closest that we can get to improving this and this, which at the end of the day impacts economics on the farm.